Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This section is reserved. The voice was sharp, polished, and utterly devoid of warmth. It sliced through the low murmur of the auditorium, a precise instrument of authority. Samuel Croft didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still on the cushioned seat, his gnarled hands resting on his knees. His gaze was fixed on the stage where a row of empty chairs waited beneath a vast American flag. He had been looking at that flag for 10 minutes, not seeing the fabric or the colors, but feeling the weight of what it represented. The crisp, pressed uniforms of the families around him seemed to suck the air from his space, leaving him in a small pocket of worn flannel and faded denim. He could feel their sideways glances, the subtle shifts in posture as they created a few more inches of distance between their pressed trousers and his own frayed coat. "Did you hear me, old-timer?" The voice belonged to a young captain, his uniform so starched it looked like it could stand on its own. His name tag read Jennings, and his face was a mask of impatient duty. "This is the commissioning ceremony for the Officer Candidate School. These seats are for the families of the graduates. I'm sure the public viewing area has some space left in the back." Samuel turned his head slowly, his movements economical, learned from a lifetime of conserving energy. He looked at the captain, his eyes a pale, clear blue that seemed out of place in his weathered face. They were calm, steady, and held a depth that made the young officer momentarily uncomfortable. "I'm in the right place," Samuel said, his voice a low, growly thing, rusty from disuse. Captain Jennings's jaw tightened. This was not the response he expected. He expected shuffling, apologies, a hasty retreat. He didn't expect quiet defiance. "No, sir, you are not. This is a private event for ticketed guests. You clearly wandered in by mistake. Now if you'll come with me, I'll escort you out before you cause a scene." He gestured with a crisp, dismissive flick of his wrist toward the distant exit doors. "My son is out there," Samuel said, his gaze drifting back to the stage and the wings where the candidates were waiting. "David Croft, he's getting his bars today." Jennings almost laughed. The idea was preposterous. He looked Samuel up and down again, taking in the threadbare jacket that had seen too many winters, the scuffed boots that had walked too many miles on hard pavement, the unkempt silver hair that hadn't seen a barber in months. He saw a homeless man, a vagrant, who had somehow slipped past security looking for a warm place to sit. The thought that this specimen could be the father of a new officer of the United States Army was an insult to the institution itself. "I'm sure," Jennings said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, Pops, I don't have time for games. The ceremony starts in 5 minutes, and my CO will have my hide if there's a disruption. Let's go now." He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "A predator trying to coax its prey from its den. Don't make this embarrassing for everyone." But it was already too late for that. The exchange had drawn attention. A woman in a silk dress a few seats down whispered to her husband, a retired colonel whose posture was as rigid as the captain's. They both stared at Samuel with undisguised disapproval. Across the aisle, a young man stood up, his brand new second lieutenant's uniform looking a little too big for his shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and shame. It was David Croft. He saw his father, and he saw the impeccably dressed Captain Jennings trying to remove him. And in that moment, David did the one thing he would regret for the rest of his life. He looked away. He turned his back, pretending to adjust his uniform, pretending he hadn't seen, hadn't heard, didn't know the old man causing the disturbance. The cut was sharper than any blade Samuel had ever faced. It went deeper than any shrapnel. He saw his son's denial, his public rejection, yet his expression didn't change. The quiet dignity that enveloped him was a fortress built over decades of hardship. He had survived far worse than his son's shame or a captain's arrogance. "I'm not leaving," Samuel stated, not with anger, but with the simple finality of a mountain refusing to move. That was it for Captain Jennings. His professional patience evaporated, replaced by a flash of raw anger. This old man was making him look foolish in front of distinguished guests, in front of new officers. He reached out and grabbed Samuel's arm, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of the jacket. "I said, you're done," he hissed, his face inches from Samuel's. "Get up, or I'll have the MPs drag you out of here." The grip was firm, aggressive, and it was the trigger. The moment Jennings's fingers clamped down on his arm, the polished auditorium dissolved. The scent of perfume and floor wax vanished, replaced by the smell of cordite, mud, and metallic fear. The gentle hum of the ventilation system became the deafening thwomp-thwomp of incoming helicopter blades. He wasn't an old man in a worn coat anymore. He was Sergeant Croft, call sign Ghost, covered in grime and blood that wasn't all his own, huddled in the belly of a shaking Huey. Outside, the jungles of a forgotten country streaked by in a terrifying green blur. He could feel the cold sweat on his brow, the weight of his rucksack, the phantom ache in his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him hours earlier. He remembered. The face of the young lieutenant beside him, a boy no older than his son David was now, his eyes wide with terror as enemy fire raked the fuselage. The lieutenant's name was Peterson, a fresh-faced kid from Ohio on his first command. "They're boxing us in, Sarge," Peterson had yelled over the roar of the rotors. "The LZ is too hot. We're not going to make it." Samuel hadn't said a word. He'd just met the lieutenant's panicked gaze with his own steady one. He checked his rifle, counted his magazines, and looked at the other 3 men of his small recon team. They were all wounded, all exhausted, but their eyes were on him. They always were. He was their anchor. He was the ghost, the man they sent in when things went sideways, and things had gone very, very sideways. The helicopter lurched violently, hit by an RPG. Smoke filled the cabin, alarms blared. They were going down. Through the chaos, Samuel remembered moving with a clarity that felt like slow motion. He grabbed the lieutenant, shoving him toward the door. "Jump," he had roared, his voice a raw command that cut through the noise. "Go now." He'd pushed. The kid out, then the others, before clipping himself to the rappel rope last, bullets stitching the air around him as he descended into the heart of the firefight they were supposed to be escaping. He didn't jump to safety. He jumped back into hell to save his men. Sir, are you all right?" The voice brought him back. It wasn't Jennings. Samuel blinked, the phantom smell of smoke slowly receding. The auditorium swam back into focus. Standing before him was not the arrogant young captain, but a 4-star general. The man was tall and imposing, his uniform adorned with a constellation of ribbons and medals that spoke of a long and distinguished career. His face was weathered, etched with the lines of command, but his eyes were wide with disbelief and something else. Awe. The general was looking at him, at his face, at the old faded jacket. His gaze fell to the point on Samuel's arm, where Captain Jennings still had his hand clamped. The general's eyes narrowed into icy slits. He didn't speak to Jennings. He didn't even acknowledge his existence. His full attention was on the old man in the chair. He took a half-step back, his posture shifting, straightening into something ramrod straight, something profoundly respectful. And then in the dead silence that had fallen over the entire auditorium, General Mark Peterson, commander of the United States Special Operations Command, snapped his arm up in the sharpest, most flawless salute of his life. It wasn't the salute one gives to a subordinate. It was the salute a soldier gives to a legend. "Ghost," the general said, his voice thick with an emotion that stunned the onlookers into absolute stillness. "My God, it is you. I haven't seen you in 30 years. Samuel looked up at the 4-star general, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He slowly raised a hand and gave a weak, informal salute in return. "It's been a long time, Lieutenant," he murmured. "You've done well for yourself." The general held his salute, his eyes locked on Samuel's. The use of his old rank, Lieutenant, a message passing between them like a bridge across 3 decades of silence and hardship. Captain Jennings, finally realizing he was in the presence of the event's guest of honor and reviewing officer, let go of Samuel's arm as if it were on fire and snapped to attention, his face draining of all color as he looked from the revered general to the homeless man and back again, utterly bewildered and unable to process the scene. General Peterson finally lowered his hand, though his eyes never left Samuel, and asked quietly, "What is going on here, Captain?" Jennings swallowed hard and explained that Samuel had been in a restricted area and refused to leave, and he had been handling the situation, but the general's gaze turned to him with the crushing weight of a 4-star commander's fury, a force that made the young captain feel small and transparent. "You were handling it?" Peterson repeated with contempt. "You put your hands on a guest of this command, a hero of this nation." He stepped closer, forcing Jennings to crane his neck to maintain eye contact, and revealed that he was standing in the presence of retired Master Sergeant Samuel Croft, whose missions were so classified that even most of the Joint Chiefs lacked the clearance to read his file. A gasp rippled through the audience, and in the front row David Croft felt his knees weaken as he leaned against a pillar, his world tilting. The general pointed to Samuel's worn jacket, explaining it had been earned during the action that awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, when he led a 6-man team so deep into enemy territory that the maps were blank, held off over 200 enemy fighters for 3 days, moved his wounded from cover to cover, called in airstrikes on his own position, and finally carried his wounded radio man 5 miles through enemy terrain. Pointing to a faint silvery scar on Samuel's temple, he recounted how Samuel had thrown himself onto a grenade in the Hindu Kush to save his team, only discovering afterward that it had been a dud. And though he was nominated for the Medal of Honor, he turned it down, saying the real heroes didn't come home. Peterson then addressed the entire crowd, explaining that 30 years earlier their helicopter had been shot down in a jungle whose name they would never know. And as a terrified young lieutenant certain he would die, it was Sergeant Croft who jumped back into the fire, led them, fought for them, and carried him on his back when he was wounded, saving his life. Turning back to Samuel, he apologized for the disrespect and the failure to care for him, then faced Jennings again, calling him a disgrace to the uniform for judging a man by his coat instead of his character, ordering him to report at 0600 and informing him that he would spend the next year learning humility and respect at a remote recruiting station in Alaska. The ceremony continued, but no one watched the graduates. All eyes were on Samuel in the front row beside the 4-star general who refused to leave his side. When Second Lieutenant David Croft was called, he walked stiffly across the stage, accepting his commission and diploma while staring at his father, seeing him not as the town drunk or source of shame, but as the hero the world had never been allowed to know. The realization hitting him like sickness. Afterward he forced through the crowd and stood before his father as the general watched silently, and with a breaking voice apologized for having done nothing, for being ashamed, for never knowing the truth. Samuel looked at him with profound, weary sadness, explaining that there are things you do and see that earn no medals, only nightmares, and he had tried to forget, to be a normal man and father, but the ghosts never left, and he didn't want them to become his son's ghosts. Admitting he had failed David, tears streamed down David's face as he hugged his father, insisting he had failed him. General Peterson placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder and gently told him it was over, offering him a good job working with young soldiers who needed men like him, promising no more streets and no more being alone, urging him to come home. Samuel looked from the general he once saved to the son he had always hoped for, feeling a lifetime of weight lift as he nodded and whispered, "Okay, Mark. I think I'm ready to come home." The story closes with the reminder that what we see on the outside is rarely the full story. that we judge by shoes and coats while true character is forged in unimaginable fires, and that every person carries unseen battles, with many great heroes wearing worn-out jackets and invisible scars. It urges us to remember Samuel Croft, to look past appearances, because we never know when we are standing in the presence of a giant, and ends with an invitation to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that honor unsung heroes.